Okay, and what I planned on doing was to just quickly go through these, and then we should have time for questions and answers, which I'm more than happy to take. Well, let me just start right in. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Many of you have had careers that have touched on the various aspects of healthcare, most notably to government. And when I began working on this book, which was when I left Pfizer after a decade in 2007, it took me a long time to sort of get my bearing and figure out what I had experienced because I had been on every side of healthcare. And after 10 years at Pfizer, I decided that any success I was having was by necessity not helping, but actually hurting. But I didn't understand quite why. And I began my exploration around that time. When I finally did publish Code Blue inside the medical industrial complex with Grove in 2019, I was searching for a metaphor that kind of captured what this medical industrial complex was all about. And I settled on Tevlar because it had these very strong, intersecting and yet cross strengthening bonds. And as I had looked at the AMA and the NIH and pharma and insurers and academics and hospitals, what I had noticed is a lot of reinforcement going on behind the scenes. So I began to look at Tevlar and noticed a lot of the cross bonds that occurred. And I wondered myself within the medical industrial complex, if I were to put it under a microscope, what might I find? And what I found was that the medical industrial complex was actually teeming with life, that the number of stories driven primarily by profitability, oftentimes by greed and the desire for career advancement, was far more intricate than I had ever realized. In fact, in the 10 years that I spent at Pfizer, what struck me is how easy my job was as the head of global medical affairs, that literally everyone was willing to cooperate, and primarily because both profitability and careers advanced when they chose to cooperate. So Code Blue really is the story about all these cross connects and what actually has been going on behind the scenes. Many of the people that I describe in the book as I'm telling the story are people you may never have met, but others are very familiar to everyone. And obviously, we're not going to go through all these people. The book in its 350 pages does its best to do that in a highly referenced way, but I will try to give you a little bit of the background of how I got to the point of writing this book. Now, I thought it'd be useful to start with a pop quiz, and here it is. I'd like you to name the person who's a lifelong New Yorker, a self-proclaimed billionaire, distorted his own narrative, has 3 wives, was a Hall of Fame marketer, lied under oath to Congress, and used Giuliani as a fixer. And the answer is, it's not this guy on the left, it's the guy on the right. So who is this guy on the right? Well, if you looked at his official narrative, he's a guy who came up out of nothing. His parents were from Ukraine and Poland at the turn of the century. He just pulled himself up by the bootstraps, and he supported his 2 younger brothers in the process. And everything just turned out great. But the truth of the matter is quite different when you begin to dig as I did. And this is, of course, Arthur Sackler. And Arthur Sackler, by the time he was 24, had already married the quite wealthy Elsie Jorgensen. He already had graduated from both undergraduate and medical school at NYU. He had come out of a prestigious high school in New York City. When he finished a year of internship, he got his first job. Now, people like my father, who came out at exactly the same time, were being drafted into the Army at the time. But Arthur Sackler never joined the Army. In fact, he was the first medical director for the U.S. Sharing Company. Sharing was a German company, and because they were about to be closed down as part of World War II, shut down because they were a German corporation, they opened a US branch, and the person they chose to head that branch was Arthur Sackler. Well, in any case, Arthur Sackler was eventually shut down along with the US version of Sharing, but jumped immediately into a medical marketing job. And in around 1945, as the war was winding down and we were getting fabulous numbers of psychiatric survivors of the war coming back, our soldiers, also many of them addicted on barbiturates, Arthur saw the future in both psychiatry and in medicinals. And so he got himself into a psychiatric residency at Creedmoor Mental Institution and stayed on there, where he created an institute, and he had no shortage of human subjects. There were 8,000 inmates in that Creedmoor Mental Institution, and it was there that he began a variety of different studies. But his idea was to create a vertical marketing extravaganza. And so he started his own academic journals. He started his own societies, including the International Congress of Psychiatry. By 1947, Elsie was divorced, but remained a business partner, and he had married his second wife, Marietta Lutz, who was part of a prestigious German pharmaceutical family. The real question is, how and why does this nation's most revered and honored heart surgeon, Michael DeBakey below, say this about the house organ of the nation's most manipulative medical marketer some 15 years later? At the time, he said, in many ways, Medical Tribune is probably the best medical publication in the English-speaking world. It's regarded in many respects the way to keep up with what happened in medicine. Well, Medical Tribune was just one arm of the vertical network that Sackler set up for himself. And Michael DeBakey said such nice things because he as well, his career did quite well with the support of Sackler. So this is one of the stories told in cold blue, and there's not time to tell it here, but let me simply say that Arthur Sackler went on to marry his third wife, the Dame Jillian. She became a member of the NIH Foundation at around the time of Arthur Sackler's death in 1987. By then, he was doing quite well with data because he had been a secret owner of IMS Health, which he had united with the Physician Master File database of the AMA. And this is what allowed the future brothers and controllers and cousins and family members of the Sackler family to identify the soft targets into which they sold their opioids and created the man-made opioid epidemic that for the first time dropped the US life expectancy record. It also was that very same family who used Giuliani to get them out of hot water in 2002 and kept the ball rolling for another almost a decade beyond that. But again, my intention is not to tell the Sackler story, but simply to say that the creation of the medical industrial complex was not an accident. It was quite intentional. Sackler was a big player in it, but certainly not the only player in it. Now, how did I get onto this? Well, if you see the guy right at the top, some of you may know of him or have known him personally. His name is Eli Ginsberg. He was a renegade health economist at at Columbia University at the time that I joined Pfizer. And I was troubled after about 2 years there and trying to figure out why I was so troubled by what I was seeing. So I had kept a classic paper by Eli from the 1980s, about the financial side of the Medicare system and how it was being shaped basically by profitability. And I found out that Eli was still teaching. He was almost 90 years old, and I called him up and he agreed to have lunch with me.
Dave, for some reason, Larry is in the motion zone.
He agreed to have lunch with me. And so for the next several years, we had lunch about every 3 months. And I kept asking him, what is this all about? How did this all begin? And he kept saying to me, well, just go back to World War II. It all began in World War II. Well, you see over there on the left side of the slide is William P. Magee, MD. That was my father. He was a MASH doctor over in France and Germany during World War II. So that interested me. And I had also spent 2 years as a travel partner to Bob Dole when he was promoting Viagra. So I had the guy who had designed the echelon system for World War II. That was Eli. I had my father, who was a doctor in World War II, and I had a famous patient, Bob Dole. In any case, I learned quite a lot about World War II, and I kept digging into it and digging into it. And as you know, when we entered World War II, or began to think about entering it, we were far from ready to participate. FDR knew in 1938 we were way, way, way behind, and did what he could to get past the isolationists in our government at the time. When he looked at the materials of war, that was kind of an easy fix, because he was told by the industrialists, if you want cooperation from American corporations, just pay them, and pay them very well. And we began to convert over to wartime economy and control consumption of goods. And we converted our cars into planes and tanks, and began to prepare to participate in the war. The bigger problem, however, was manpower. And at the time when FDR began his movement to support the war, Germany was the #1 army in the world. It had 6.8 million soldiers in 136 divisions. The US was the 18th largest army in the world. We had only 5 divisions. By 1943, however, we had managed through the draft and other means to get 16 million soldiers. Now, the important thing to realize is it wasn't enough to just have the soldiers. You had to have them healthy and battle ready. So the question is, well, what were the threats that would keep us from putting healthy soldiers into this war? From our experience in World War I, the biggest threat was the fact that many, a large percentage of our soldiers suffered from shell shock when they were in World War I. So the first idea was, well, let's be really, really rigorous in our psychiatric evaluations during the draft. And so we rejected a full 12% on psychiatric grounds. And that included everything from homosexuality to blinking cross-eyed. You know, we just made it very tight. But the problem was when George Marshall had the first major battle in Tunisia, a third of the battle casualties were neuropsychiatric. So this notion of restricting entry was a huge failure. So Marshall said to William Menninger at the time, who was the head of psychiatry for the Army, we need a new strategy. And the strategy they developed was forward psychiatry. It was the creation of psychiatrists right at the battlefield so that you could treat people who were beginning to get shell shock and get them right back on the line. And the guys that he trained were called 30-day wonders, and my father was one of those 30-day wonders. And one of the big strategies, you can still see it in YouTube videos, was the use of barbiturates. So here you see heavy use of barbiturates along with a heavy number of psychiatric casualties. Now, the second issue was motivational. It's always been bad to be a soldier in the war. In the Civil War, for example, the Army gave 10 million doses of opioids just to keep those guys in the war. When they all came home, we had a 500,000 opioid addicts that we had to deal with. Industry was always very helpful. For example, the creation of instant coffee was at the request of the original Morning Joe, the head of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. And John Pershing said, hey, look, we need cigarettes more than we need bullets. So instead of having to roll those cigarettes, we invented for World War I soldiers the actual carton of cigarettes where you could just pull one out and it already would be rolled for the soldiers. We also gave officers daily rations of alcohol. There was massive use of amphetamines at the beginning of World War II. And of course, nearly everyone, including all of the Army doctors, smoked throughout the war. Now, the other obvious huge problem was venereal disease, which could be disabling at the time for up to months. They had whole hospitals to treat our soldiers, and we tried all sorts of branding and efforts and good girl posters and bad girl posters, and nothing really worked. So a huge problem throughout World War II was venereal disease. And then, of course, we never quite solved the problem that war creates massive mental instability. Menninger did his best. In fact, he created that slide up at the top that had a whole kind of classification system of psychiatric illnesses. And he had actors play out soldiers and how to use barbiturates. And the last thing on the film, he says, now use these liberally. And then when Menninger finished, he immediately became an operative in the new DSM-1 classification systems for the American Psychiatric Association. So the classification that he created for the war became the basis for the DSM, and he already had the treatment schemes for all of these different maladies. So the beginning of the use of heavy doses of medication began in World War II as well. As for specialty training positions and our tendency to specialize American medicine, there were only about 5,000 specially trained physicians in 1940, but by 1950, we had nearly 20,000. And part of the reason for this was the fact that with the GI Bill, you were able to get reimbursed for the education that you went to for specialty training. And in World War II, if you were a specialist, you had a higher rank and were paid more than the everyday soldiers like my father. In any case, the other side of this was this fellow here, Vannevar Bush. Oh, back in 1942, he was on the head of Time magazine. And at the time, he was heading up a $135 million organization of science, research, and development with 18 divisions and over 2,000 investigators. In Time magazine, they said, meet the man who may win or lose the war. And it was because it was Vannevar Bush and his organization that developed not only radar, but the first mainframe computer, the A-bomb, but he also developed the immunizations that we use, the blood bank, and a variety of other treatments, including antibiotics. Now, the story, though, of Vannevar that most people do not know is that he was staffed up with people he had worked with before. Primarily, his number two guy was George Merck, who had been CEO and still was CEO of the Merck Corporation. He was his director of biological warfare. Alfred Newton Richards, who headed up his medical research, had been a consultant for Merck since 1931. John Connor, who was his general counsel, was a VP of government relations at Merck. When Vannevar Bush finally broke from Truman at the end of the war, he went immediately onto the board of Merck, and subsequently, when George Merck died in 1955, Vannevar Bush became chairman of the board. The rest of these guys here stayed for their entire professional lives with Merck. And in 1949, one of the famous quotes Vannevar Bush gave as part of the board of Merck Merck was, if one knows where the breaks are likely to occur, he makes effective contact with those who are at the forefront of the advance, aids them in any way possible, and watches for places where that aid can become independently applied. Now, of the 10 largest pharmaceutical firms in 1979, 9 participated in the World War II penicillin program. So if you participated, if you made the contacts as the corporation in the medical industrial complex during World War II, it almost was certain that 50 years later, you would be a major success. As for the physicians who were coming home, there was a massive move towards specialty training supported by the GI Bill. And in 1948, there were 120,000 doctors stateside. We had 45,000 doctors in the medical corps as of 1945. Same thing too with nurses. The nurses came home. They had grown in huge numbers during the war. There were only 1,000 nurses in the Army Nurses Corps in 1942, but 150,000 nurses by 1948. And the problem was when they came home, they were quite well trained, but they had no place to work. And so we instituted the Hill-Burton Act, 4.5 beds per 1,000 citizens all across the country. And of course, if you build it, they will come. So the notion of massive hospitalization for a wide variety of ailments provided a workload for these nurses as well as a place for them to work. As for the pharmacists, the AMA and others worked very hard to keep them second-class citizens. They were never allowed to have their own corps in the Army. And the reality is we don't even know how many pharmacists served in World War II. As the U.S. Army Surgeon General said in 1944, any intelligent boy can read a label. And that bias against a pharmacy as a profession was well entrenched in World War II. Now, not only did we begin the medical industrial complex and codify it in World War II, but we created a chronic disease burden that was second to none. So by the time all these people came home with medical and psychiatric problems that required treatment, we were there building hospital beds, specializing our docs, and getting ready to fight disease. Here's the poster boy for chronic disease, General Eisenhower, who became President Eisenhower, and he smoked at one point about 4 packs of Marlboros a day. So how does that translate onto the softball field? Well, for a vet coming back from World War II, they lost 11 years of expected life. 5% of them were disabled. They had twice the rate of lung cancer. Their alcohol and drug abuse levels were through the roof, and there were over 1 million psychiatric casualties, which in part explains why Creedmoor Institute under Sackler had no shortage of human inmates for experimentation. So what is the original sin here? The original sin is that we decided that if we could simply defeat disease the way we had defeated the Nazis, through cross-sector cooperation and American ingenuity, laced with a high promise of profitability and professional advance, that health would be left in its wake. That basically the definition of health was the absence of disease. And as a result, then, fast forward 70 years, we're spectacularly unprepared for something like COVID because we never built an infrastructure for that purpose. In contrast, when the exact same kind of disease burden, but at a much smaller magnitude, appeared back on the Canadian shores with their Canadian soldiers, they spent 10 years asking a very fundamental question: how do we make Canada, and all Canadians healthy. And after 10 years of deliberation and planning, they launched their system, and in 10 more years, they created their own Medicare around the same time we did in 1965. But theirs was available to all, and ours was available just to those over 65. So any thoughts I had about what could be done concretely. And so I prepared this slide. In the book itself, in the last chapter, I offer up a wide range of suggestions that touch on everything from direct care to our approach to continuing medical education to our way that we do research and publications, and everything from what happens with CME to what happens with PBMs and a wide variety of the other structures that we have in place. But if I were to list, starting in the top left, the most important, I think the very first thing I would do is take the brand that has been most successful and seems to be most valued in this country, and I'd open it up to access to as many as I possibly could. Why would I do that? Because I think we would learn very quickly whether people will vote with their feet. I think many employers who do not like having the role of being the head of healthcare, as well as trying to do whatever their businesses do, would be more than happy to hand that over. I think many of the employees would value Medicare as well, because I know from my own experience being in a corporation that many people wait around to 65 just because they need to wait until they can have access to Medicare. So I think quite a few would switch over, and certainly those who feel vulnerable and left out would as well. The second thing I would do is, in any way possible, and many of the ideas I cite in the book, and even a few that are on this slide, I would in any way I could disrupt this integrated professional career ladder, this notion that if you go along and get along, you can move from academia to industry to government and back again, and have a well-protected and highly successful. This means that I would directly attack what I think is a very outdated notion that in academic medicine of this triple mission, that somehow everyone who is in academic medicine is a researcher, an educator, and a clinician. I think this has provided moral cover for a great many activities that are just not defensible. In my view of the modern world, if you're involved in biomedical research, there is no room for you to either be a teacher or a clinician. You're basically focusing on creating the next best thing, which is great. You own now, because of our changes in the patent laws, the patent along with your organization, which means immediately you're going to have business partners. You are rising or falling in your rank based on the grants that the NIH is providing and your position on their advisory groups. The pharmaceutical companies are paying you to be advisors to them, as well as enhancing your career by getting you great speaking opportunities, all of which I'm for. I'm 100% for innovation, but I don't like to mix that up with the job of caring for America's patients, or the job of educating the next batch of doctors and nurses and health professionals who are committed to serving our people. I think that those need to be severed. In fact, I believe if you're on the payroll as a researcher, you need to be declared as a lobbyist, and you need to be fully vetted by the government before you're taking on posts or government money. So that's the direction I would move. I'd also eliminate all DTE see advertisement. We're only one of two countries in the world that even allows that, and it clearly has no salient benefit and a lot of harm. I wouldn't allow PBMs to do any financial kickbacks. Their whole opaque use of kickbacks is legal bribery. It's indefensible. I think the AMA and its federations all need to have full disclosure of their 990s in a single site on an annual basis, so you can see how much of their money comes from whom and how they're relying on data and supporters. I don't think you should be able to publish anything if you haven't put the results on clinicaltrials.gov. We have a rule that nobody follows, and there's no teeth behind the rule at all. And I think that the patient advocacy organizations, many of whom are hostage to their funders, need to, in a very standard and visible way, disclose for everyone to see all the in-kind and out-of-kind money that they get and why they get it and what they've agreed to do in return for it. So those are just, I could go on, but I think there are things we can do to address the specific challenges, but at the core, we need to ask the question, how do you keep America healthy? And then we need to decide, if we can figure out how best to do it, who will govern it. And the idea that you take one from the AAMC and one from the AMA and one from the AHA, I think is indefensible. I think what we need is to decide, well, who, for whatever we are trying to build, is best suited to do what is going to be a multi-decade, very difficult job to make this conversion happen successfully. So I will stop there. I'm going to, let's see, I guess, drop the slides out now. And stop, I guess, stop the share, Mike.
Yeah.
Mike, yes, okay.
That way we can see folks, and folks can throw up hands. There we go. We're already in a queue. But before jumping in with Robert and then Hank, I just want to just announce here that we, for our upcoming Intergenerational Summit, we've just gotten Pramila Jayapal to join us. This is on November 19th. And it directly connects with what Mike is talking about in terms of solutions. We have to create a movement. We have to create the power to actually back these legislative ideas, these concepts that he's advocating. So there's an intersection here of creating a political movement that is, we're at the forefront of that right now, one pair states. So if Mike, if you could drop the link into the chat for the upcoming event, and also if folks can help out with some small donations to help us offset costs, that would be great. Thank you so much, Mike. So let's just jump right in with questions. Robert, just tell us where you're from, and folks can sort of indicate that when you rename yourselves as well, and encouraging people to do where you're from and your organizations. Thanks so much. Robert?
Bob Crayson, Columbus, Ohio. I'm with Span, Ohio. Mike, I just would like to get the name of your book. I didn't see it anywhere. Couldn't find it anywhere.
Okay, here it is.
Just happen to have one. Code Blue. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, it's Code Blue. It's Grove Atlantic. Paperback came out in 2020. And yeah, it's available on Amazon and everywhere else as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Mike, yeah, really, really excellent. Definitely going to jump on a copy myself. Hank from Maine.
Thank you. Love the history lesson. It was great. So in all the time we make presentations, when we talk about negotiating drug prices, the argument will be, if you cut back the payments to pharmaceutical companies, research will decline, lives will be lost, American intervention will cut back, European reference drug pricing will kill the pharmaceutical research. So one, I'd say, what's your 2-minute versus comments versus you want to come back in a couple of months and give another presentation on your thoughts on that regard?
Sure. Well, part of my job, the major part of my job was public affairs, which is to say, you need to absorb all of the messages, and then you need to defend your company in every way you can. And most of that has to do with convincing. Now, in my own experience, when I was brought aboard, my boss was the CEO and his consigliere, basically. And they had by then weaponized all of public affairs. So it all existed in one organization, corporate affairs. In corporate affairs, we had myself, the head of medical affairs. We had the head of communications. We had the head of media. We had the head of shareholder relations, the head of investor relations, the head of public affairs in general, the head of and the head of all of the IT. All of these people were reporting to the same person. Once a week, we would get together and coordinate all of the messages for that week. It was a highly weaponized and well-informed group. And each of us in our field had more than 25 years experience. So what you have then is a government relations capability on steroids. And so one thing I would say is you cannot underestimate how experienced and coordinated those fighting to hold on basically to wealth are. In not only in pharma, but this is true of the hospital industry. It's certainly true of the AMA and any of the insurance industry. Any of the major sectors have moved in this direction. Pfizer happened to be at the forefront of it in 2000, but everybody has this kind of coordination at this point. I mention that only to say that, yes, of course, they're going to say, if you do anything to affect our profitability, we're going to collapse. But the other thing that Code Blue does is go through all of the efforts from before Reagan and certainly beyond to basically free the hands, not simply of pharma, but of everybody who worked with pharma, not simply for the insurance industry, but everybody who worked with them, everybody who was part of the medical industrial complex. And they were able to be highly successful because when you coordinate all these people, they do well. So for pharma to lose profitability means that others lose profitability too. The AMA loses profitability. Every patient organization you can think of lose profitability. All of the people who are part of the PBM downside cycle are losing profitability. So yes, there's great resistance to it. Is there any rational reason for us to be paying what we're paying? Absolutely not. Is there a reason why 1 in 5 of our citizens are employed by the medical industrial complex and that we're spending more than $4 trillion a year? No, there's no reason. There's no rationale. So to some extent, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, of course, when you're spending twice what you have to and everybody's on the dole, right down to the, precinct level with this thing, you're going to hear a lot of people say, this is going to have dire consequences. But the other side of this is that a lot of those very same people who might be somehow employed through this stream of graft are the people who are actually either not having their own insurance covered or are dealing with medical debt and a lot of other things within their family setting. So remember that, there's two sides to this. And so I think what we have to do is, I guess what I'm saying is you can't do this thing piecemeal. What you're up against is so coordinated and so well funded that if you try to piecemeal this thing, you'll never be successful because the opponent is too strong. That's why I sort of favor this notion of opening up what is already popular, like a Medicare, and saying, okay, you say nobody's going to sign up. Let's see. Let's see who signs up. How quick? How far will this go? Will it go so far as to tip it to the point where people are saying, well, geez, if we have that many people on it, we might as well just make it national, right? So I'm sort of that mode, only because from a practical standpoint, I don't think you can defeat these guys by picking little pieces of this thing. Certainly we could tighten up, certainly we could reinforce some of the stuff that we dismantled in the 1980s, but I don't think that that's enough. I think basically you got to provide the ability for Americans to vote on their feet for something that would be bigger and better.
Thanks, Mike. Let's bring up Michael Penn. Michael? Quick question.
Yes, question, yes.
Thank you.
So, yes, so I noticed in the slides, you talk about the top 10 solutions, right? And the one I was really interested was in the AMA physician profile. If you could bring the slide back up.
I'm sorry, you'd like me to share the slide?
Yeah, because I want to ask that question, yes. It just caught my attention.
All right, I'm going to push share screen then. 1 second.
Okay. Sir.
And are you talking about the last slide?
Yeah, the last slide, yes. The top,
Okay,
the top solutions.
there you go. You should, oh wait, 1 second. Here we go. There you go.
Yes. So here I'm just curious. So it says that you must you must opt in into AMA physician
Oh.
master profile.
Yes.
So-
As it stands, you get into the physician master file profile. Up until recently, you got into it without even knowing you were in it as a medical student. And you were tracked throughout your entire professional life. In fact, even if you died, you stayed in that master file. That master file since the 1950s has been mixed with a second database that one of whose secret owners was Sackler. We only learned that in a fight over inheritance in the 1990s by the Sackler family. That's when that was revealed. But in any case, the mixing of those two databases was what allowed you to target and find out what every physician was prescribing on a monthly basis, which is what they then used to help their salespeople decide who were the soft targets, who should they visit the most, where were they going to get the greatest results. So in any case, the AMA database was essential. The other thing is that over 50% of the AMA's funding now, the money they receive each year, if you look at their 990s, comes from data sales, and not from membership dues, but from data sales. And the biggest one of those, or one of the biggest, is this physician master file. So there was a move, there was a lot of criticism a decade or two ago about this, and the fact that everybody was contributing to this master file without agreeing to it. And they said, okay, we're going to set up a system where if you don't agree with having your name and address and contact information as part of our database, you can opt out. So you can take an action and you can say, Mike Magee does not want to be there. And what I'm saying here is that they should be forced to use an opt-in strategy, which is to say, I would have to, on the front end as a medical student, say, yes, I want to be listed in your database. And if I didn't take that action, I'd never end up there. So it's it's a way of forcing people to actually make a decision rather than finding out somehow that they've become part of something that is commercial that they may not agree with, and then take the steps necessary to get oneself removed from what is a commercial database that is sold primarily to those members of the medical industrial complex that are trying to sell into the network.
Yeah, and the second question is because you mentioned about the annual FDA.
Michael,
Sorry.
we'll come back for a second question
Okay,
after we
sorry.
get through the queue,
All right,
okay?
sorry.
Thank you. Barbara Pearson?
Yes, I'm also looking at that slide. So if in fact CMS is successful as they would like to be in making all of Medicare privatized within the next few years, and they're getting pretty close, would you still use that same advice to open up access to Medicare? Do you think it would be effective if it were a privatized Medicare?
Well, the question I have it has more to do with transparency. I'm a very pragmatic person. So if I look at the major players in the medical industrial complex loving the heck out of Medicare Advantage plans, I say to myself, there must be a lot of profitability in the Medicare Advantage plans. Otherwise, why would they sell? And does that mean that we have incentivized them too much to get them to participate in the back end of managing medical claims and so forth? And is there some way that we can trim that down? The area that I think needs to really be explored is how much private involvement do we actually need? Do we have any public capability to manage the nitty gritty back end of this thing on our own? Or must we work through, the insurance industry, who then is working behind the scenes and cutting the deals with the hospitals, with the doctors, with the pharma and so forth. And then all of a sudden we're into PBM land. And then we got to allow the movement of data and kickbacks in order for the whole thing to work. So I do think, Barbara, and I don't have a good answer to your question, I do think we need to seriously consider who our partners are in all of this. Now, I would say that if you take a look at what Canada decided to do way back 70 years ago, is they decided to leave control local. And they decided to deal the provinces in and allow them a role. And I think the reason for that was that they recognized that this is a very complex form of business, and decision-making on access and so forth. If you try to do it too much as a national program, it's not going to be successful. Now, the other difference, though, was that on the front end, they made it very clear that they were only going to cover about 70% of healthcare, and that people, if they wanted more, would supplement with their own expenditures. So basically, their private system is living on the back of those supplemental plans in Canada. So I think that were we to take a serious look at this, there is a core group of things that, especially if we simplified the billing of it all and standardize access and basically shut down the direct marketing, that it could be done much more in a streamlined way and might not require the level of privatization that we sort of think we need now. On the other hand, I think that this notion of not covering everything, but covering the essentials and allowing people to buy up if they want to, means that there might be enough room for some of the private people to continue to be quite successful. So anyhow, I think the scare tactic is, okay, You're not willing to pay us a 17 or 18% premium on your Medicare Advantage. We're going to drop out, and then you try to run your own Medicare. Well, the reality is we can't have it both ways, right? If we want
Yes,
to
we
serious,
can.
oh, we can. Okay, how then?
I mean,
how can we?
until very recently, Medicare was doing great until they started giving it away.
Okay, yeah. Well, if what you're suggesting is for us to pull back on Medicare Advantage, I'm all for it. Okay,
Medicare Advantage, ACOs, DCEs,
Yeah,
so forth.
yeah. I'm all
I'm-
for simplification because
And
simplification.
transparency, you said.
Yes, to me, simplification translates into a much smaller manning table. So, for example,
Thank you.
I've sadly had to go to multiple doctors recently, and everywhere I go, I am amazed that when you go to the receptionist and you look behind them, there are like 6 or 7 billers in a single doctor office. I'm saying this is nuts. So I do think that with streamlining this thing comes a much smaller manning table and hopefully easier access for the rest of us who need the care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, Mike. We have just a few minutes. Ronnie and then Anne. And then again, in the chat, folks, please do help out with donations for this upcoming summit. Join. This is all about building the power to win these reforms. Ronnie?
Thanks. So this was a great presentation that really brought up memories for me. As a retired pharmacist, I remember seeing issues during the Vietnam War where soldiers were being immunized with narcotic antagonists and depot injections and coming home or not making it to Vietnam and coming in for psychiatric treatment in the 60s and 70s. It's scary, that connection. And that's my question is, how much is our Veterans Administration connected, our military system connected now with research, with efforts to bypass primary care or the patient-centered or optimal care for our military? Is that still being abused?
Yeah, I think my basic, and this sounds terribly cynical, but it comes from direct experience over many years from every angle of this thing. When in doubt, presume that everyone involved is on the take. They may not admit it to themselves. They may believe that they are unassailable, that they can't be influenced. But the reality is that the system can't get this large and this unregulated without massive complicity. And so when I hear things, when I hear great excitement over something like personalized medicine, I know that right behind the scenes of that are NIH grants. And right behind that are deans of medical schools. And right behind that are young researchers who can see already the next great patent. So, I think the sad part about it is that, as with me, because throughout much of my career, I felt that what I was doing was attempting to understand better the patient-physician relationship and improve our management of fear in a society that desperately needed hands-on kind of contact. But what I realized fairly late in my career is that the truth of the matter is that I was reinforcing a lot of these alliances that had very little to do with patient care at all, but really had to do with career advancement and enrichment on every side of the equation. So I do think there is tremendous goodness there. And I do think it can be redirected, but I think the problem, the original sin is structural. It was an incorrect interpretation of what health was, and an approach that was more successful in fighting an armed enemy than in actually creating a stable and civic and participatory society.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks, Mike. We're just past the hour, but we'll slip you in here, Ann and Michael. You can correspond. Mike, do you have an email perhaps you can share with us?
Sure do.
Follow up? Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's Dr. Mike Magee, Magee @gmail.com.
And real quick.
Hi, Dr. Magee. I am reading your book, and I'm reading several at a time, so I kind of stopped somewhere, and I wanted to kind of check this out with you, and maybe this is even another subject, but you touched on the fact that patient advocacy groups don't exactly support fixing the system or fixing how we pay for healthcare, because my sense is that the little bit of effort I've made with we've got somebody with MS, we're the MS Society and NAMI, neither one of them is willing to work with us on single payer system or fixing how we pay for healthcare. And my sense is that they're getting so much money from funders, primarily the pharmaceutical industry, that they're hands off, a real fix. And the second related point, I think I was at the part in your book, I'm going to have to start over because it's so complicated. I was about the fact that medical research in this country is kind of manipulated by lobbyists rather than by an overarching approach to what do we spend research dollars on, what will actually improve the health of a population. Is that what you were kind of trying to get at?
Yeah, starting with the second first, I do think there is a governance issue for research overall. It was interesting to me that several of the earlier books on the problems with the healthcare system, one particularly by a person who used to be head of the Mass Medical Society and New England Journal of Medicine, dealt with everything except publications. And yet publications, in terms of who they chose to publish and so forth, is a highly commercial activity. And one of their major sources of revenue are mass reprints that the pharmaceutical industry buys for distribution. So, but there was no serious examination of peer review or how we do publications. And it's been shown by many investigative reporters that it's a problem area. So yes, there is a problem there with the governance of the research enterprise. As far as the first question, tell me again, Ann, remind me again of the first part of that.
You touched on the problem with patient advocacy groups and conflict of interest. Yes. Elizabeth Rosenthal talked about that in her book also.
Yes, she did.
And our little experience with trying to talk to, NAMI here in Minnesota and my friend in the MS Society says they're not interested in helping us fix our healthcare payment system.
Yes, well, the reality is that nearly 100% of the funding of staff, materials, office space is funded by not just the pharmaceutical industry, but the medical device industry and a wide range of others. And so, how can you criticize people like the MS Society or whatever, where the people that they're representing are in desperate need, and what they need most is a sense of hope. And so they are trying to establish, some path to a solution, right? So it's hard to come down hard on it. But the way this, again, is designed is that they are beholding. Now, what are they beholding for? Number one, if their sponsor gets in trouble, they hold the fire. Okay, they do not criticize when the guy who's funding nearly 100% of their operation is being attacked. Number two, letters to representatives. They are expected to generate through their membership large numbers of letters, and if necessary, personal appearances in Washington and at state houses in behalf of whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, whether it's the approval of an investigational drug or whether it's to keep legislation that's going to hurt their sponsor from happening. And then the third thing that they're expected to do is to not respond to requests like yours. You know what I mean? I mean, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. And so, well, what's the fix for this? Well, the fix for this is that if we feel patient advocacy organizations are important, then we need to fund them through public funding. And give them the opportunity to serve. And again, this comes back to the initial Canadian question. What would it take to make Canada and Canadians healthy? If they felt that patient advocacy organizations were part of what it would take, then they funded it, right? And we didn't. What we did was say the people who run fastest, hardest, behind the scenes and win the market, well, we'll take some of their winnings and we'll spread them around. Well, that's no way, I think, to run a healthcare system.
Thanks so much, Mike. We're going to have to close off here, but just connecting the dots here, what I call the political industrial complex that wraps around all of these industrial complexes, right? The nonprofit industrial complex, the agricultural industrial, the medical, the military. You did a great job. Look forward to having you back again. Really excellent presentation. Thank you. Virtual applause from everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. And please save the chat, please, folks. Help out with the work that we're doing. We're building the power to deliver these solutions. This is really the work. We're on the cutting edge right now. We have a great opportunity with this upcoming election and thereafter. So thank you so much, Mike, for coming in.
Thank you.
You're awesome.